We've been assigned by the tyrant, Mark Skousen, to talk about the dirty dozen federal laws. I'm John Stossel of Stossel TV, formerly of 2020 and Fox, and thank you. I'm just moderator here, so let me introduce the talkers. Keli'i, it's hard to pronounce these Hawaiian names.
You're doing good, John. Keli'i.
Keli'i. Akina is with the Grassroots Institute of Hawaii. Anastasia Boden is with the Pacific Legal Foundation. And Sean Flynn is a professor of economics at Scripps College. So why don't you start with yours, Sean? Pick one of your four.
Okay, great. So I've been spending a lot of time studying free market healthcare for the last 10 years, and there's a lot that's screwed up. I got to give a presentation a couple days ago to some of the people here, and I've got a book that's just coming out called The Cure That Works, which covers all this, but there's something I didn't cover in that book, which is probably the most egregious thing I've ever heard of in healthcare, and almost no one knows about it. And so what happened was in 1992, the federal government gave an exemption to kickback laws and antitrust laws to these middlemen in the pharmaceutical industry and the healthcare industry. So there's two groups. There's called pharmacy benefit management companies. The biggest one is CVS Caremark. There's only 4 of them left, and they're kind of monopolizing things. And then for everything else in the hospital that's not drugs, there are these group purchasing organizations for the rubber gloves, the medical equipment, and so on. And so before 1992, before Congress passed this horrible law that is now costing you $200 billion a year, right? It's probably 10% of all medical costs in America every year. There were these little nice nonprofits, and let me just try and explain this. We're going to make everyone in the front row here, you're all going to be administrators of local hospitals. And like, let's say you're in like rural Pennsylvania, western Pennsylvania. You guys are going to be drug companies, okay? Before 1992, you like that? I know you know all those guys. You've been needling them, right? And so before 1992, when it was illegal for me to ask for kickbacks, I would go to all the hospital administrators and I'd say, hey, make me your agent. I'm a nonprofit. I'm not going to hurt you or charge too much. Just I'm going to take a little bit just to pay myself, but I'm going to get you guys all together and get a group discount for you, right? Individually, you're all small, but together you're like a major hospital. And so then I go to each of the drug manufacturers, and she might be the only maker of, say, aspirin in the country. This might be the EpiPen company. That might be, I don't know, Lipitor. And I'd negotiate you a group discount. And it all worked fine till Congress eliminated the antitrust laws. They gave them what's called a safe harbor provision, right? So they can't be prosecuted. And so now what happens, if you remember payola on radio back in the day and stuff and pay for play, I will now go to each of you as hospital administrators, and what I'm about to tell you is perfectly legal. I will say, you're going to sign a non-disclosure agreement, so no one's really going to find out, but you are going to give me the exclusive for your hospital, and I'm going to pay you $1 million. Right? And it's 1099 income. It's perfectly legal. You'll pay income taxes on it. There's nothing illegal. But I do that, $1 million for each of you hospital administrators. I lock up all that business. And now I turn around to the drug manufacturers and I say, hey guys, you can't even sell one aspirin to the entirety of Western Pennsylvania without my say-so. I've locked up the market. I've cornered the market. And then if you hear about a company, aspirin, generic medicine, that suddenly the price of the generic quintupled, it's very often that's because they need to pay me a bribe and a kickback to have access to the hospitals again, right? And so this is costing about $200 billion a year. Someone did a documentary about this a few years ago, and they interviewed, I think it was a bunch of congresspeople and maybe 17 senators, and they pretended like the interview was about something else. And I know John doesn't do this. He's upfront about what he's interviewing people on. But then in the middle, they asked him about these pharmacy benefit management companies, and every senator's face sort of went blank, and you could see they knew about the problem, but there is so much lobbying money behind the pharmacies now, and the pharmacists and these PBMs. They're the #1 lobbying industry, ahead of the insurance companies, ahead of Wall Street, ahead of the defense industry, that this is now basically locked in because there's no politician who's willing to push back against this. But so that is my #1 top evil thing there.
Okay, before we go to Anastasia, I should say that Mark wanted me to print up a list of the dirty dozen which we have here if you want to come by and grab one of them, but we'll be talking about it. And I'm going to sit here because the acoustics are tough up there, and I can't hear them unless I'm in front of them. So, Anastasia, what's your first one?
Well, John, I'm an attorney at the libertarian nonprofit law firm Pacific Legal Foundation, so I sue the government for a living, so it's very difficult for me to choose just four. Yeah, a lot of cases. Business is booming. But my main work is representing entrepreneurs and small businesses in challenges to anti-competitive regulations, regulations that do not protect public safety. They just exist largely at the behest of bigger companies who want to get rid of their competition. And so I wanted to pick a law that sort of illustrates that principle. It's anti-competitive, it frustrates innovation, it frustrates progress and the provision of important services to our society. So I chose FDA regulations that require pre-market approval for potentially life-saving innovations like drugs or medical devices. Nowadays, you not just have to prove that these things are safe. We all care about safety, of course. You have to also prove that they're effective. And together, these two requirements mean that on average, it takes 12 years to get a product from innovation to approval, if you're approved. Only 12% of applications are approved. And on average, it costs something like over $2 billion to innovate a new drug. And so under the guise of protecting public safety, the FDA is actually killing people. And, I think that's wrong. To take a recent example, it recently came out that Pfizer had found that there seemed to be some sort of correlation with its arthritis drug to Alzheimer's. They had patient data and they were seeing some sort of correlation. But rather than investigating that, because it would have cost $800 million to even go through the initial steps of that, they chose to just shelve the data and get rid of it. They didn't explore it any further. And that's a result of the regulatory landscape, and that's my first regulation.
And they would say, well, I would push back and say, if somebody is dying, how can the state in any conscience feel okay about saying, you cannot try something? It's your body. Don't we own our own body? But they would reply, well, if we allow exceptions, everybody will want one, and you won't know that the medicines that you are taking are safe.
Yeah, it is a moral crisis here where the government thinks that they own your body, that they can tell you what to put into your body, and that they can tell you what products you're allowed to innovate and bring to society. So that's a problem. The presumption is no longer that, live your life, be free, do no harm. It's no, you need to come to us and ask for permission first. And that's a crisis, I think, that we need to attack just in the marketplace of ideas and switch that presumption back to the presumption of liberty.
Could I jump in on this? So this is wonderful you're doing that because it's going to save a lot of lives. Another thing, which I'm not sure you could sue for, but which would be great, is to go back to what the FDA did before 1962. So before 1962, all a drug manufacturer had to do with a new product was prove that it did no harm, that it wouldn't make you ill, it wouldn't make you sick. They didn't have to prove beyond safety, they didn't have to prove that it actually worked. Right? So what would happen, and this was sort of what John was describing back then, is a new drug would come onto the market, and typically for whatever you need to treat, like high blood pressure, there's already several existing drugs. And then doctors could decide, they knew it was safe, and they could work with their patients and say, hey, maybe you should experiment with this new drug. It might work better for you than the old drug. And if it did, then that doctor would write up a little journal article, and word would spread around to other doctors, and that new drug would eventually get market share because it actually worked better, right? It's sort of crowdsourcing your clinical trials for efficacy. But the FDA got rid of that back in 1962, and it now takes, $2 billion to prove a drug is efficacious? And they often goof up that process, right? What was it, Zocor? There's been several of these drugs where they thought it worked, and then the FDA 10 years later said, no, it kills people, right? So the current system for testing doesn't even work. So I would suggest, I don't know if you could sue for it, I don't know if it's what sort of law it is, but yeah, to go back to the pre-1962 thing where you only had to prove safety, not efficacy.
And here, as usual, my business is your enemy because the press only reports the problem. The FDA once announced, this new heart drug we're approving will save 14,000 American lives a year. And no one in the audience said, excuse me, didn't that mean you killed 14,000 people last year and the year before that? It did mean that, but no reporter thinks that way. Keli'i, you're next.
Thanks, John. Appreciate that very much, and aloha, everybody. Good to see you today. I'm Keli'i Akina, president of the Grassroot Institute of Hawaii, and we have the distinction of having the absolutely most expensive public transportation project on the planet per capita. It's our rail system, and many of you know that from your own regions. It was supposed to cost $2.5 billion. Now it's costing $9.5, and we expect it to go up to at least $15 billion. It's not even halfway done. The federal government is already investigating for fraud, waste, and abuse and has suspended its funding so far. It's really a huge failure, but it's not just the Hawaiian Islands that produces such a thing. This exists because of a federal practice of dangling money in front of politicians who want to make a name for themselves and who want to collect money from contractors to support them. And we've seen this all over the country, this incentivizing by the federal government, and then the federal government pulls back the money when the project is no longer affordable. And you've seen it elsewhere. For example, in California, the high-speed rail system, which was going to be a $77 billion project, that's been cut because it's just been mismanaged totally. Or perhaps Boston's Big Dig, which originally was going to cost $2.6 billion, it took 17 years to finish, and it ended up costing $15 billion. And I can go on, including Alaska's Bridge to Nowhere. I think the problem can be solved if the federal government stops incentivizing this wasteful kind of use of money. And in addition to that, we look to privatization of these projects. In fact, all across the world, rail projects are being privatized, and that's what makes them work. But more than that, we have to get with the new technology. Today, it's Google and other companies like that that are going to be giving us autonomous vehicles that will make rail systems a thing of the past.
And
well, I hope you're not applauding our rail system.
Also for sport here at the end, why don't I'll read down the list and we can have a contest by booing which one you think is the worst. In terms of the transportation subsidies, people say, well, there's certain things government has to subsidize, like the subways in New York. Nobody could afford to dig those tunnels to move all those poor people. Few people know that most of the subways in New York were privately built. They were making a profit until they tried to raise the subway fare from a nickel to a dime. The government said, that's too much, we're going to take it over. And they haven't made money since, and they charge everybody more. Sean, your next one?
Okay, so also centered in New York, or at least applied mostly in New York, the Dodd-Frank Wall Street, what was the name they put on it? Reform and Consumer Protection Act, which doesn't do much of either. In terms of reform, no one went to jail, as you might know. And if you want to look it up, there's a great op-ed, it's many years old, it was published around 2011 by the guy who back after the savings and loan crisis in the late 80s, early 90s was the head federal prosecutor. And he pointed out in that much smaller property bubble, they did 1,850 separate prosecutions, put 2,200 people in jail, and clawed back gazillions of dollars for the federal government, right, taxpayers. We didn't prosecute anyone, and then this Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act basically allows, there's more capital controls, and there's sort of nitpicking little things, but it's not going to prevent the next bubble. It's not going to prevent the next set of bailouts. It's probably going to incentivize them because people know there are going to be bailouts coming and how they're going to work and everything else. And so that's a looming disaster. It might take 10 or 20, 30 years. But hidden within that was something even worse, which was the creation of this legally and politically unsupervisable entity called the Consumer God, I always screw this up. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is now underneath the Fed. And as people in this room, there's so many libertarians know, the Fed is basically run by the member banks. It's, quasi-public, but it's pretty much a private institution. It only has limited responsibility to, do anything for Congress. The Fed chief shows up every 6 weeks to give a little song and dance. But basically, it runs on its own. It can literally print money. And it has no, need for Congress to appropriate funds. And so the Fed itself is already kind of running wild. But then underneath that, this Consumer Protection Bureau, it now is legally has to be funded by the Fed. It can tell the Fed how big its budget is going to be, and it has massive supervisory authority all over the economy to do basically anything it wants, just as long as it's related to any sort of payment or credit transaction everywhere. So we now, and just so you know, if nothing I'm saying here sounds scary enough, the first person who volunteered to be the first head of it was Elizabeth Warren. Okay? And so this is basically an untouchable little part of the federal government that is alleged to do something nice for consumers, but is probably going to end up being co-opted, regulatory capture, and the way many bureaucracies are, by the big Wall Street firms, and then used to exploit people. Like, for instance, if these people were serious, those minimum payment numbers on your credit card bill would not be there to fool you, right? For people who aren't good with numbers, those minimum payment numbers are so low that whatever balance you have, it'll take like 37 years to pay it off, right? And you'll end up paying gazillions of dollars of interest payments, right? That, I'm a behavioral economist. People, are sometimes not quite rational, but you shouldn't let the banks and the credit card companies go around intentionally making people have really low monthly payments so that they'll have more interest to pay off over the long run, right? So you can see how little this Consumer Protection Bureau actually wants to do, because that was an obvious thing it could have done instantly 6 years ago when it was created, and didn't. And so this is sort of on my list as someone who does finance and behavioral finance as something that is a pernicious evil that will come to bite us sometime in the next 10 or 20 years.
And I thought Sarbanes-Oxley was going to solve all the financial problems. It didn't do anything. We get a new law. Anastasia, your next one?
Well, at risk of sounding like I don't love animals, I do love animals. I have to say, if you love animals, then you should be against the Endangered Species Act, because it's really a travesty when it comes to protecting endangered species. There was a survey recently, and they asked Americans, how many animals do you think are on the endangered species list? And people guessed that there was between 80 and 100. No, there's been nearly 2,000 animals listed. And yet, while we've prevented, only 1% of those animals have gone extinct, so it's very good at preventing extinction, but it's very poor at promoting recovery. Only 3% have been recovered and taken off of the list. So, okay, they're not going extinct, but it's not affirmatively doing anything for these animals. But in the meanwhile, it is wreaking havoc on property rights. And it's having a detrimental, disincentivizing effect on private efforts at recovery. So there was also a study recently done about property owners that had property near a listed woodpecker. And those property owners knew that if there was any woodpecker found on their property, or if there was any sort of habitat that was found to be conducive to the woodpecker, that they were just going to get regulated out of any value to their property. They weren't going to be able to develop it. It was just going to go down in value. So what they all did was they cleared their property of any potential habitat for that endangered species. This is a travesty. It disincentivizes things that we want to see. Pacific Legal Foundation frequently fights against the abuse of the Endangered Species Act. We recently had a case, the Supreme Court, we were a party in the Supreme Court case this term, where the property owner was told that he could not develop his property because it was a critical habitat for an endangered species, when in reality, that species could not survive on that habitat at all. He would have had to invest hundreds of thousands of dollars in converting it to make it habitable for that species. These are the kind of abuses that go on, and they're real cost to this supposed great goal that we're not even promoting.
And Anastasia, in terms of unintended consequences, can you explain the phrase shoot, shovel, and shut up?
Well, that's what we're talking about, John, is that these property owners, they are afraid of having any endangered species on their property. So what they're going to do is they're going to get rid of any evidence that their property has these species, or that it would be a good place for these species to come. And that's a sorry thing.
Hence, they shoot, shovel, and shut up about it. Keli'i.
John, I've got another one for you. But let me ask everybody a question. And again, I'm Keli'i Akina with Grassroot Institute in Hawaii. Who do you want to determine the supply of a product you enjoy and use, the demand for it, and the price for it? Do you want the free market to do that, or do you want your government? Absolutely, the free market. But one of the classic examples of the government taking over that role has to do with sugar, and we don't even realize it. Sugar subsidies and sugar price floors have dominated the market since the Depression era. And at that time, the government wanted to help people out. They had very good intentions. They said, let's reduce the supply of sugar and raise the cost of sugar and help sugar producers in the United States. But over the years, the exact opposite has happened. It's actually helped only a few people. It's doubled the price of sugar, and it was supposed to save an industry. Well, I come from Hawaii, where sugar and pineapple were king, and today you can't find sugar cane in the islands. It's not so much because of this federal policy, but it proves that this federal policy doesn't work. People in Hawaii said, we absolutely need these sugar subsidies, and it failed to save the industry. What saves industries, actually, we've learned from the automotive industry, is the free market and the ability to compete. One of the things that the sugar subsidies do is they create the equivalent of tariffs, causing the cost of sugars to remain artificially high and the supply low. And that's something that not only happens in the Hawaiian Islands, but across the nation. For example, it's estimated that yearly the sugar subsidy costs consumers and businesses $3.5 billion, and we lose 20,000 jobs a year in agriculture because of it. Let me close by reading to you something that comes from the CEO of a candy cane company, the Spangler Candy Cane Company. It's been in existence for 100 years, and this law has hurt them so badly they've had to send most of their manufacturing business to Mexico. Recently, there was a slew of applications for jobs for the Spangler Candy Company, and the CEO wrote this: I would love to offer 250 people more jobs as a candy cane maker, but our government insists that sugar processing jobs are more important than manufacturing jobs. They are picking winners and losers. Our town has been the loser for many years now. Now, I love that phrase. This manufacturer understands it. The government is the one who chooses winners and losers, and that's what happens. And in the end, we all lose when they control supply and demand.
And what do you say to so-called conservatives like Marco Rubio of Florida, who says Brazil is subsidizing Indonesia? As long as they do, we have to protect our people.
The reality is we are not a third world nation. We are not we don't have the same conditions such as low wages and so forth. So you can't compare, so to speak, apples and pineapples. You've got to compare apples and apples together. In the United States, what we have seen over and over again, and in developing nations that actually win economically, is that when the free market is allowed to set supply and demand and the price, you actually have prosperity for industries and businesses. The reason the other examples work to keep prices low is because they don't have the free market to the extent that we do.
Sean Flynn of Scripps College, you're third.
Okay, so I'm about to talk about and complain about the civil asset forfeiture law, but let me just follow up with the sugar, because the indirect cost, the $3.5 billion, is a correct number, but it doesn't take into account the knock-on health consequences. And so what happened was we jacked the price of sugar up so high with these tariffs, trying to keep up out Cuban sugar, foreign sugar, that there was a market opportunity that was opened up for anyone growing corn and who wanted to make high fructose corn syrup, right? If there were free markets, the price of regular sugar from cane or beets would be lower than high fructose corn syrup, and therefore all the manufacturers of Coca-Cola and everything else, anything with sweets, would be using that. But because we jacked up the price of sugar so high fructose corn syrup ended up being less expensive, and almost anyone who was using sweets to manufacture foods in America switched to it if they could. And that has been really bad, because high fructose corn syrup is digested differently in your body. It's much more likely to make you obese. It's much more likely to cause diabetes and a whole bunch of things. So if you were to quantify that, my guess is you would be adding billions, probably tens of billions of dollars a year onto the cost of the sugar subsidy, and, to your point earlier, killing people, right? Because I think something like 40% of Medicaid costs have been estimated to be due to diabetes now, right? So we're killing people, hurting them, and all because of this little tiny subsidy that directly only costs the federal government a few $1 billion a year, but it's like a giant lever. The Fed's putting $1 billion here, and then suddenly it's causing tens of billions, hundreds of billions of damages on the other end. It's terrible.
And I want to add that I happen to have done a video about this. The part that most galled me was that the sugar industry still advertises with World War II posters of hungry people saying, do you want to trust that you won't be hungry to the free market? We need protection, which is just insane. All these agricultural subsidies are bad. And fruit farmers don't get them, plums and peach growers, vegetables like peas. I'm amazed they don't point out that why does cotton and soybeans, why do a few of them need these subsidies? We do fine without them, but they don't point that out. And just to plug myself, johnstossel.com if you want to see these videos and join up so we can send them right to you once a week. But Sean, what's your third?
Okay, so maybe the most unjust thing I know about in our legal system is civil asset forfeiture. And they're both state laws on this as well as federal. We're talking about federal laws here, so I'm going to specifically complain and say that this should be overturned. But if you don't know how these laws work, like normally, right, if the cops suspect you of a crime, stealing pineapples, say, you're driving around with stolen pineapples, they're going to arrest you, charge you with stealing pineapples, and then because you have a car full of stolen pineapples, they can confiscate that as evidence and everything else. However, if you get, if a judge lets you out for whatever reason, a legal technicality, you get a good lawyer, some reason like that, you get your property returned to you, including the pineapples, right? If they couldn't prove that you actually stole them, you get your pineapples back, right? And this is a property version of habeas corpus, and they just can't take your stuff. They can't lock you up permanently, right? But with civil asset forfeiture, the cop can pull you over and just look at something in your car, or something in your house for that matter, something sitting outside your house, you got a boat parked there, and say, I think that was bought with drug money. I think that was bought with gambling money. I think the provenance of the funds used to purchase that was illegal, and so I'm not going to arrest you, the person who owns it or has it at the moment. I'm actually going to legally sue the object. Now, this doesn't make sense, but if it's the state of Virginia, you'll see things like state of Virginia versus $5,000 cash confiscated from a guy. State of Virginia versus a jet ski, right? They're literally, this is so stupid, they're suing an inanimate object, right? And they take your stuff. And then it gets even worse because in most jurisdictions, the way it's been set up, the confiscations, the stuff that's confiscated will usually go to auction. And the money from that goes back to the police officers who made the initial arrest against the inanimate object, right? And so there's been a lot of abuse of this. One town in Texas about 10 years ago, they were pulling over hundreds of people a month, just searching their car and taking their stuff. And there was basically no way for these people to get their property back, right? No crimes committed. They could prove it was their money or their property. And this is done at the federal level too. So at a minimum, I would like to actually get rid of these laws. You shouldn't be able to just sue an inanimate object, right? This is just goofy. But at a minimum, we should make sure that if there is a civil asset forfeiture thing, the money goes into the government's general fund. It shouldn't go to the agency that's making the arrest and then giving them an incentive to, it's not an arrest, right? To sue lots of inanimate objects so they can get property and auction it off and then buy themselves a new truck or something.
Anastasia Boden, Pacific Legal Foundation.
Yeah, well, I will follow up on that by saying there's another type of forfeiture that I think is just egregious, and that's if you owe even just a couple of dollars in taxes due to some sort of mistake, some sort of calculation error, or in one case we had a client where his tax bill was sent to the wrong address, and it was only a couple $100s, but the government will actually seize your home or your property, sell it for the $3, and keep the rest of it. They won't give you the rest of the proceeds. And in fact, in some states, they'll even give that right to a third party. They'll say, hey, third party, you sell the property, give us our $3, and you can keep the proceeds. And this is just one of the biggest injustices, I think, right now. But this is getting depressing.
It is. It's horrible.
We'll try to bring some levity
your pen?
to it. Yeah.
I can sue you for it.
I'll try to bring some levity with the next law. This is the Antiquities Act. It's a lesser known law. It was signed by Teddy Roosevelt, and it was intended to give the president the authority to establish monuments on lands controlled by the federal government. And like most things, this has been abused such that now in recent years, the Obama administration started a practice of designating thousands of square miles of oceans as lands oceans are not lands, that are now considered monuments and can no longer be used for beneficial uses like sustainable fishing, recreational activity even. It's just, they're totally off limits. Beyond the territorial seas now, they're considering that lands. But in any event, it's really sad that it's a one-way ratchet, because what proponents are saying is that while a president can designate lands, no subsequent president can ever pull that back. And in fact, when President Trump tried to rein in some of the monuments to reduce the size, environmentalists immediately brought a lawsuit saying you can't do that. Once it's made a monument, you can never make it. You can never take it off the monument list. And so it's a one-way ratchet and an exercise in crazy semantics.
Keli'i of the Grassroots Institute of Hawaii, you're third.
Thanks, John. Appreciate that. Let me ask everybody a question. I'd like to see by a show of hands, how many of you have heard of the Jones Act? All right, this is a well-educated audience. Strange things happened with this 1920 law, or set of laws that the United States passed, having to do with the transport of cargo between American ports. For example, in Hawaii, ranchers found that it was cheaper to use airplanes to fly their cows to the mainland rather than use ships. And as a result, many of them have absolutely gone out of business because it isn't cheap at all to fly cows on ships. And it's not even fun. I talked to one of the ranchers on our big island, and they said, you don't want to be piloting a plane full of cows, especially with the sounds and the smells that they have. You know, one of the most famous kinds of beef is Wagyu beef. It is hand-massaged, beer-fed, and flown first class. I'd rather save the money and get the hand massage myself, drink the beer, and fly first class. And that's one of the economies we could get if we could update this Jones Act. But in addition to that, states like Maryland and Virginia import their road salt rather than getting it where they can do it most cheaply from Ohio because of the Jones Act. And New Jersey, during a recent hurricane, needed emergency road salt and had a ship right off coast with enough road salt to meet their needs. They couldn't use it because they had to have a Jones Act ship. And I could give you example after example. Texas, for example, shipping to New England costs about 3 times as much as shipping to Europe. As a result, there are many American companies that import their oil rather than buy cheaper oil from Texas because of the shipping costs. Can you imagine that? And in Hawaii, we can't get liquid natural gas shipped to us from the cheapest and most prolific producer of liquid natural gas, Texas, because there is no Jones Act ship that can carry the liquid natural gas. Now, rather than recite a longer list of this, let's just describe what this law says. It says 4 things. Number 1, any ship that is used in commerce between American ports must be built in the United States. That's the most important clause. We can't get it from our allies. We can't get it from Japan or South Korea. We can't get it from Norway. Secondly, it must be crewed by an American crew. Third, it must be flagged American. And fourth, it must be owned as an American ship. Now, those rules seem to make sense back 100 years ago. And the biggest reason given for them is national security, because at that time when we went into World War I and World War II, we needed to be able to militarize cargo ships in order to do battle. But have you noticed we do battle a little differently today? We hire kids who are good at video games. Basically, in the 15 minutes that it would take for a nuclear warhead to get from North Korea to Los Angeles, we're not going to go down to the docks and militarize cargo ships. It's a different world altogether. So the Jones Act has actually become very, very outdated. In addition, it's become very costly because it's created an artificial scarcity of the supply of ships. Going into the Jones Act era, 1920s, we became the largest, or we were the largest producer of ships, or one of the largest producers of ships in the world. Today, I don't know if you can believe this or not, but we can document it for you. The United States produces less than 1% of all the deep bottom cargo ships on the planet. Now that creates an artificial scarcity because we tell our businesses we have to use these ships. As a result, they have to pay 5 to 6 times as much to buy a ship than buy it from an ally. And in addition to that, it costs 5 to 6 times as much just to maintain and just to operate. how could we change this? Well, right now there's a political standstill between those who want to repeal the Jones Act and those who want to keep it the same. At the Grassroot Institute of Hawaii, we're proposing a measure that comes in the middle called Update the Jones Act for the 21st Century. Don't worry about the national security side because it's not significant at all. Don't worry about the job side because if we update the Jones Act, the number of jobs that are affected are too small anyway. But just change one thing about the Jones Act and we could have huge economies in our economy, and that is allow our private shippers to do what the military does, and that is every time they can do it, buy a ship from our allies rather than buy it from our own market. Create greater competition, and let's update the Jones Act. Thank you. John, let me just add one thing. A lot of times people think that the Jones Act affects only Hawaii and Puerto Rico. The reality is that before trains and trucks can take cargo to our inland areas, they have to get to the United States by ship. So every one of the 50 states is deeply affected financially by the Jones Act. That's why we should all promote some change in it.
But good luck in America getting anything repealed, because there are interest groups holding on tight. Last round. You have a fourth, Sean?
Sure, and actually it goes right to this point about interest groups holding on tight, and one of the ways, unfortunately, Congress has allowed them to do this. So it's not a specific law, but it's about procedure. And the problem is Congress now has delegated its authority to regulatory agencies. And some of you might have been here, I think it was 2-3 years ago, Senator Ben Sass of Nebraska was here, and he told us a little story about how he got elected. So this was 2014, he's like late 30s. He rents a bus, he and his wife and their 6 kids go around the state, they visit every single county, but he needed to have a prop. He needed to show people what he was gonna do and what mattered to him, and also what was going wrong in the country. And so the prop he came up with was based on the Affordable Care Act and Obamacare. And so if you look into that law, it's about 2,000 pages, and you all know it's egregiously long, and it hasn't worked very well, but there are over 1,800 instances in that law where Congress delegates the authority to the Secretary of Health and Human Services to decide on very important things, like how much you're going to be charged for drugs, whether there's going to be competition in certain sectors of the industry, right? All that Congress, there's sentence after sentence that begins with the Secretary shall, the Secretary shall. And so then what happens is the special interests can lobby that regulatory agency, lobby the government officials, and get whatever they want put into the regulations, right? Because most of federal law is not what Congress passes, it's the regulations that follow from it, right? Which is one of the problems with the Dodd-Frank that we're talking about earlier. And so what Senator Sass did to get elected was, and this was I think 2014, and Obamacare was passed in 2010, so the Secretary had had some time, 4 years, to write regulations. It turned out that at that moment in 2014 when he was running, they had written 60,000 pages of regulations, right? And they weren't done. They were only about halfway through the regulatory writing process. So what he did was he got a couple of dollies and a drill, and they actually piled up all 60,000 pages on dollies, drilled a hole, stuck a steel rod so they would be, welded that to the bottom of the dolly, and then they could march that around, and he would get his picture in the paper in every local newspaper in Nebraska because people wanted to stand next to the 60,000 page stack of Obamacare regulations that Congress had given oversight to a regulatory agency, right? This is fundamentally unconstitutional. The legislative power is vested in Congress. They cannot delegate it, but this has now become routine that they're delegating it. And so as a general matter, to try and get some of these stupid laws undone, it should be, we should get rid of that and make sure Congress actually reads every piece of legislation, makes every law, and therefore there could be some hope of democracy repealing bad laws, because it's basically impossible when it's regulations.
We have to speed it up. We're running out of time here. Anastasia, you're fourth.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak a little bit to the Controlled Substances Act, which, talk about a failure. It's really undercutting the fabric of our society, because we are incarcerating people at an astonishing rate for nonviolent drug offenses. In 2014, there was over 1.5 million people arrested for nonviolent drug offenses, and nearly half of people serving time in federal prisons are there for drug offenses. And that's a problem because prison has a detrimental, long-lasting effect on people for the rest of their lives.
So you would legalize everything?
Well, look at Portugal, where they did do that. And deaths dramatically went down. There was no increase in drug usage. The rate of HIV went down because people were no longer using dirty needles. It's improved society in Portugal, and I think it's a good example, and it speaks to how, again, these laws are enacted with good intentions, but we don't examine what effect they're actually having. We're not looking at the facts and seeing that these laws do more harm than good and do not effectuate their goals.
Keli'i, you have a fourth?
Sure. Mine pretty much speaks to the reason all of these strange laws come about and all of these subsidies and so forth. It's the violation of the Federalism clause of the Constitution. The Constitution basically tells us that the powers not delegated specifically to the federal government are reserved for what? For the states.
And the people thereof.
That's very important, the states. And when power goes from the states, it never returns. All the money that the federal government has is money it takes from the citizens in the states. All the power the federal government has is the power it takes from citizens in the states. And so be very wary, states and citizens. The government is not the answer to your needs. We know that now in Hawaii, which has become so debilitated economically due to its dependence upon the federal government. What we have to recognize is that it's time to take power from the federal government and return it to the states.
Okay. So I was afraid some of them wouldn't come up with their fourth, and we were told to do a dozen. So we could have also thrown in the Davis-Bacon Act, which raises government construction costs, the anti-gambling rules that some are federal and allow Las Vegas to happen, but make it illegal in the rest of the country, the rule against unpaid interns. I built my career with unpaid interns, and they loved it, and they learned stuff. The home mortgage deduction, which favors rich people. Social Security, which favors old geezers like me and is unsustainable. The federal student loans, where the banks have no interest in checking, what are you studying? Gender studies or engineering? It makes no difference. But those were mine. They didn't make the cut. But let's do a boo vote here for choices. Keli'i, I'll start with his. The Jones Act. Sugar subsidies. But even transportation subsidies and boondoggles. The feds grabbing power from citizens and states. Well, I think that's the leader so far. Anastasia's the FDA banning trying things. Endangered Species Act, shoot, shovel, and shut up. The Antiquities Act. Controlled substances. Is that the leader?
Maybe it's
Maybe.
Yeah, I think that might be
The leader. Sean Flynn's safe harbor exemption from anti-kickback laws. Dodd-Frank. That's it so far. Civil asset forfeiture. That's it so far. And Congress taking over delegating authority to the nerds at these regulatory agencies. I think they just got more into their boos.
I think that's right.
I hope to never be booed that many times again.
Well, thank you. I'll give names again. Keli'i from the Grassroots Institute of Hawaii, Anastasia Boden, Pacific Legal Foundation, Sean Flynn of Scripps College. I'm John Stossel, johnstossel.com. I make videos about this stuff and would love your help. If you see a video we should include, please send it to me. And if you want to make a donation to help me keep going, please do that too. And thank you for coming today. Wow, I sped you up only to wind up too soon.